patient. The importance of interprofessional communication cannot be overstated. Helping the patient receive the best outcome can only occur if collaboration with fellow healthcare members, the patient, and the family takes place. Teamwork is important in every aspect of life, but especially when a person's health is at stake. The healthcare field is built on trust and vulnerability, and a bad experience can ruin the delicate relationship that exists between a doctor and a patient. A bad experience that is caused by poor interprofessional communication is not only detrimental to this relationship, but can cause further harm or injury. And it is crucial that we remember the reason for our existence, to serve God and to serve each other. Thank you.
Well, I don't have a question, but I just wanted to say I really loved your topic because communication, when you're creating care plans for any patient, is vitally important. You need proper communication between each structured part of the medical field. And it's something that, it's funny, I actually didn't get to go into this in my presentation or my paper, but I didn't get to talk about the importance of developing a proper care plan for a geriatric patient. And I just love that you were able to put that in your presentation.
Thank you.
So I had a question. You talked about how education is a really good solution to this problem, teaching students now before they actually get into their professions. What can we do now to help people who are like already doctors? Because we can't like send them back to school. Is it just like a mindset thing that they have to like switch in themselves?
Yeah, I didn't look much into this, but I'm sure that there are like courses that anybody who's already in the field can take to learn more about this.
I'm afraid to tell you all that you're not done with your education yet. When you graduate, there is something called continuing professional education in almost every field, so they're probably trying to help them with that.
Yeah, I also just have a comment. In my business class, management information systems, we talked about a company in Africa that's setting up a network that connects all of the pharmacists and doctors and everywhere over there, and I kind of, it was interesting to me to see how this could kind of apply to that, because if they're all connected, then they'll better be able to communicate and make sure none of this bad stuff happens.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
Okay, what was I going to say? Okay, that situation that you were talking about where the one woman was getting the wrong medication, and then later on you mentioned how patients are like vulnerable and they have to trust the doctors that they have. Do you think it would be smart as a patient going into like a doctor's office or something to like bring someone else with you who's like ready to ask questions and take notes and stuff like that? Just like do you think there are things that we can do as patients that can kind of increase communication between us and the doctors that are in a rush and hurry?
Yeah, definitely. So the cases that I was looking at with the one with my mother and then as well as the one with the incorrect prescription, they were both elderly patients, so maybe like they weren't able to like fully understand and like comprehend whatever information they were being given. They were just like lost in like the medical turmoil that happens, just so many people, so much going on at once. But maybe like having like somebody who is able to understand more, like take notes, like you said, would definitely help alleviate any of the stress and help solve any problems that could occur.
Something that interested me that you talked about was how a lack of organization within the healthcare world can contribute to this problem. And you said that creating a more cohesive structure within the system could help with this. So could you elaborate on that? Like, how can we make everything more cohesive?
So when I was looking into this, a lot was that doctors view themselves as like a That is not what you want to hear.
But you know what? I just went for an ultrasound that just showed me that I have absolutely no blood clotting, whatever. I've only been here for 3 hours. I'm not going to take that blood thinner because I don't even know if I'm going to stay. And his response was, well, they told me you had to. Now what kind of confidence do I have in someone who's approaching me that way? And so I said, well, why don't you take it back to them and say, she's being a Karen. She said she doesn't want to take this because I can't tell her why she needs it when she knows that right now she has no blood clots at all and isn't even admitted to the hospital. But that's the kind of stuff that you end up having to do. And then I felt like I'm already labeled out at the nurse's station. We got a problem with 432. But if you're going to be an advocate for yourself, you have to be ready for people to decide that you're a problem child.
Yeah, a lot of times patients are too intimidated to really ask like the medical staff any questions. So that's very interesting.
And if you do ask, if you're not intimidated and you do ask, you're going to get pushback.
Yeah.
Like you're a problem. Even if they have posters on the wall that say, be an advocate. Here's what you have the right to do and ask as a patient. If you follow through those things, there will be doctors who will come up to you and say, and when did you go to med school? Because I've had people ask that when I've been an advocate for my mother-in-law.
And that also goes back to the hierarchy we see in the medical setting.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, I've learned that I'm not going to cross Kathleen Trigg. I'm not going to tell her what to do. I failed to mention that Ms. Vasquez was recently on a soccer trip. She's one of our athletes in the honors program. We have a couple of cross-country runners here tonight, right over here. If they look tired, it's because they run too much in the state of Florida. Why anybody runs in the state of Florida, I don't know. The weather's finally getting nice, though. And the interdisciplinary nature of this, of course, is obvious. Communication and healthcare comes out again and again. Geriatrics, and even considering the demographics of the country, is another. So you're talking about the socialization of people, their expectations, the economics of things. And so Jesse Trimble is going to come to us next and talk to us about the matter of geriatrics and the problems we're having finding medical care. So, Jesse.
From 1950 to 2020, the life expectancy in the United States rose from 68 years to 78 years, a 10-year difference in over 70 years of medical research and progress of modern-day medicine. Through the continued efforts of medical researchers, people can now live longer and healthier than they ever have. This has contributed to the growth of the elderly population, and it has been predicted that by the year 2030, there will be a 55% increase in individuals over 65. This means that in the year 2030, there will be 73 million people who qualify as geriatric patients in the United States. However, despite the advances in Western medicine, there has been a major decline in the number of geriatric physicians. In the year 2000, there were reported 10,270 geriatric professionals in the United States. It lowered to 8,500 in 2010, and currently there are only 7,300 geriatricians practicing in the United States today. To put that in perspective, there is approximately one geriatrician for every 10,000 patients right now. It is projected the number of geriatricians will continue to decline in the coming years. Therefore, the irony that I like to say of healthcare is the goal of healthcare is to allow people to live longer and healthier lives. But unfortunately, by the time you qualify as a geriatric patient, there are not enough healthcare professionals able to treat you. Geriatric patients are considered complex because they have different pharmacological needs, chronic illnesses that cannot be cured, declining physiological and cognitive ability, and require a different type of care and care plan than the average patient. Dr. Lester, Dr. Darmajan, and Dr. Weinstein are 3 geriatric physicians that have devoted their lives to ensure patients receive proper treatment and to raise awareness on the shortage of physicians. In their article, The Looming Geriatrician Shortage, they explain that the geriatric physicians must recognize the impact of aging on the body and endeavor to adapt interventions to address these challenges. This means that geriatric medicine must focus rather on the quality of life and giving patients realistic expectations of the deterioration of bodily function while preparing sensible plans for treatment. The article points out 5 geriatric M's that represent the target issues most geriatric patients possess. All geriatric physicians must consider these when developing a treatment plan for geriatric patients: mind, mobility, medication, multi-complexity, and matters most. All 5 of these must be considered by the geriatrician when beginning to understand what their patient is going through and how to proceed. However, the question remains, why are medical students not choosing a career in geriatric medicine? In 2015, there was a study done by 3 doctors in the Department of General Practice and Elderly Care Medicine at VU University Medical Center. They compiled a survey of medical students modeled from 20 different studies taken from all over the world. In these studies, the students were interviewed about geriatric patients and their relationship to geriatric medicine. Most relationships were developed based on their clinical years in med school. There are many reasons revealed as to why medical students chose other specialties over geriatric medicine. First, there is a low financial reward for treating geriatric patients. The salaries in geriatric medicine are about 20% less due to there being smaller schedules at clinics and hospitals. Medicare also contributes to smaller payouts for doctors because Medicare only covers a set amount of fees, and many elderly patients are on Medicare. Medical students reasoned that due to the high volume of debt acquired from medical school costs, the amount of money earned as a geriatric doctor would not offset the deficit and give room for a more glamorous lifestyle. Secondly, the type of ailments that geriatric patients have are seen as less desirable for treatment. Geriatric care is focused on quality of life, as I've said before. Long-term solutions to ailments that can only be treated, not cured. Geriatric patients have medical problems that they have sustained for years because the physiology of an elderly patient is different than that of a young one. The most common chronic ailments in geriatric patients include arthritis, diabetes, pulmonary disease, kidney disease, dementia, and Alzheimer's. These chronic illnesses cannot be cured with modern-day medicine, and therefore geriatric physicians will have to prescribe treatment and medication that eases the symptoms rather than eliminates them. Many of the medical students took it personally that they could not completely cure their patients' ailments during the clinicals and therefore developed a belief that geriatric medicine is less rewarding. Medical students also became overwhelmed by the number of ailments each patient possessed and the ambiguity of sickness. Many medical students were frustrated because they could not diagnose the sickness due to multiple symptoms presenting themselves, and many students were overwhelmed by the polypharmacy that made writing prescriptions difficult. Another reason why medical students are choosing other specialties is that there are not enough faculty members who teach or can teach gerontology. Students were not taught how to deal with the complexities of geriatric patients and therefore were not prepared for the number of ailments that each patient possessed. However, there were cases in this study that revealed when medical students were properly trained to handle complex patients, the medical students did begin to recognize treating geriatric patients as rewarding. But perhaps the most important reason to our study as to why medical students did not choose to specialize in geriatric medicine is that medical students were afraid that geriatric patients would be non-compliant and harder to deal with due to age difference. Geriatric patients are seen as cranky, obstinate, and difficult due to prejudices based on attitude and urban myth. Younger patients are acknowledged as more favorable because they are seen as easier to work with. I believe that this reason for choosing another specialty is the most important to be analyzed because it is an idea based in the opinion of medical students rather than fact. Any patient can be difficult, but the fact that difficulty of a patient was related to age by medical students raises a new problem. This problem is not due to lack of education or careless attitude about treating patients who need help. Instead, it is due to ageist beliefs that develop into a negative mindset towards geriatric patients. Negative stereotypes told older patients have become more prevalent in modern-day media and culture. Stereotypes such as, geriatric patients are less worthy of care because they are older. Geriatric patients do not wish to be helped. Geriatric patients are burdensome and worthless. And geriatric patients are angry and argumentative and therefore are too difficult to be treated, have all been thrust outwardly into the media. These stereotypes are not only detrimental to society, but also to the mental health of the geriatric population, because they proclaim that elderly people are not worthy of care and therefore they are no longer respected. Negative reinforcement of these stereotypes leads to the degradation and mistreatment of the older population, which fuels unnecessary hate and causes a barrier between the older population and the younger population. This barrier prohibits the younger from recognizing that the older population is their future, and therefore causes an unrest between the younger and the older populations. However, it is important to address why the younger population views the older with such disdain. Jared Daniel is a writer who specializes in health and human behavior. In his article, Society Fears Aging, he notes that there is an underlying idea in society that aging is viewed as an incurable disease, and this attaches a fearful stigma to aging. He reasons that the fear and denial of aging creates barriers between the different age groups and therefore breeds resentment in the younger population that is fueled by social media, pop culture, and literature. He remarks that this resentment leads to improper care of the elderly population in clinics, hospitals, and other care facilities. Nancy Osgood is a professor of social gerontology at Virginia Commonwealth University. In her article, Society Does Not Respect the Elderly, she remarks that in America, there is a youth cult that praises vitality and youth, while old age is associated with decline, disease, disability, and death, rather than wisdom, inner peace, and other positive qualities that had previously been associated with it. She reasons further that older people are seen as reminders of our own mortality and therefore fall victim to prejudices and cruel jokes. She argues that the biggest problem these prejudices create is the current argument for euthanasia and assisted suicide among the older population. The only way that we can unite the younger and older populations in the United States is through the recognition that there is no us versus them. Everybody ages. Everybody's health declines. It is a natural part of life, and life does not only have a beginning and a middle, but it has an end. Christians know that even though the outward body declines, there is an immortal soul that remains and can abide with God if they have been faithful. The older population should not be neglected due to prejudices or biased viewpoints based in the deterioration of the outward body when the soul is more important. In John 13:34, Christians are commanded to love one another as God has loved us. And in 1 John 2:9-10, we are told that God is light, and he that loveth his brother abideth in the light. And we cannot abide with God if we do not love our brother. I've always believed that loving one another is the easiest and yet one of the hardest commandments that God has given us. However, we are commanded to love one another despite the differences in opinion, culture, and differences in age. Geriatric patients should be considered just as important as any other patient, and healthcare professionals should want to help these patients no matter their complications or age. The growing population of geriatrics in the United States should not be seen as a burden, but instead as an opportunity for medical professionals to assist and learn how to properly care for a population of people growing at an alarming rate. Healthcare professionals should be servants and examples of brotherly love in the world today. Thank you.
Cranky and obstinate.
Yes.
Wouldn't know anything about that.
I was going to use crotchety, but cranky sounded better.
Caroline, you have a question or comment?
You mentioned that one of the biggest problems was euthanasia and assisted suicide. How has that been affected by this problem?
I didn't look too much into it, but Nancy Osgood's article is very important because it starts out with an example. I believe it was from 1970, and it was a woman who, she was happy, she was a geriatric patient, she wasn't even sick, she had a family, she had children and grandchildren, and the Hemlock Society, which was a society that does support, or did support, I don't believe they're together anymore, they did support assisted suicides in the older population, even if they weren't sick. And I thought that was very sad. But I think that I read another article, and it was about how the older population are seen as drains on our healthcare system, and therefore maybe we should be putting it towards other patients and having more doctors be working with other patients rather than people that are going to die anyway, which I felt was very sad.
So I need something clarified before I ask my question.
Yes.
You said that the salaries in geriatric medicine are usually less because there are smaller schedules at like hospitals and stuff. What is a schedule?
Oh, it's like the amount of time that the doctor works during the day, but it's also due to Medicare as well. Medicare is a bigger part of that as well. And it's that a lot of elderly patients have Medicare, and when they come in with Medicare, they are covered, but the amount of money the doctor gets is less because there's a set of fees that Medicare pays, and therefore the amount of money the doctor gets paid to help a person is less, and it's not as supported.
Okay, so considering like the smaller schedule and then the issue of how few geriatricians there are for the number of patients, could you like comment on like that discrepancy and how that's like contributing to the problem?
You're referring to like how it's gone down, or like?
Yeah, so if
Okay.
there's like so few, or there's not as much like time and opportunity for the geriatricians, but there are so many patients, how is there that like disconnect?
I think in clinics, there's less time that you're working, and in hospitals, you get like immediate care. Like sometimes it's not, the people you meet in hospitals are not there just for sustainment. They're more population, like percentages, they're more going downhill, and that's like a few days care. And I don't think hospitals are employing as many geriatricians as well, just because they're trying to get more doctors that are internists, because that's very important. They get more specialists. And yes, geriatric doctors go to the fellowships, they do the same fellowships, but they still aren't being hired as much, even though there's demand.
First of all, you should be a motivational speaker because that was really good. But also, did you look into any of the like how nursing homes kind of play a role into this at all? Did you like see any of
I
that in
did
your research?
not. I did see an article. Oh no, it was Jared Daniels' article when he's talking about society fearing aging. He talked about that nursing homes are actually bad because they cause the separation between society even more, because it's kind of like you're sending them somewhere to go where we don't see them, and it's kind of like they're being cared for on the side.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I'm glad that you saw that in one of yours. You brought up the point which I really liked at the end of your talk where you said like people are seeing it as such a separation of like us versus them. And we're trying to move away from that. And kind of the thing where geriatric doctors and geriatric nursing and all that kind of stuff started whenever nursing homes were created. And they were created because like a long time ago, hospitals started booming. They didn't have room, so they created separate wards, and they just put people there who were older and didn't need as much care, or weren't as much trauma. So they sent them there, and that's when geriatric doctors kind of started being a thing, geriatric nurses, all that kind of stuff. But now we're moving away from the nursing home world. More and more assisted living facilities are getting started to where people can live in their homes or apartments for their whole life, and they never actually go to a nursing home. And so people who work there are typically like nurse practitioners or family doctors who work with patients in middle age through adulthood. So they see these people as they're healthy before they come in and they're really old and decrepit. So they see them through their life and they want to just keep their quality life as good as possible. So I do think that there is, everything comes in waves. So I do think there is like a new wave coming, which is going to be interesting. Just knowing that, like I know recently they started making doctor programs and nursing programs take a course in gerontology. So yes, although like there are not gerontological doctors being trained anymore, which is kind of crazy because that's a whole other story and it's really cool how they learn all this stuff. But they are making everybody take classes in that, which I think is helpful. But I love this topic. I love that you brought all this up.
Thank you.
Emily brings up a good point, though. I mean, when do you start to find geriatric wards? The urbanization of America, the growth of hospitals. Who took care of older people before? Families, extended families, right? Social structures like that. And people just didn't live as long. I mean, disease, cancer, you name it, will take people at an earlier age and take them at a younger age. Because now you can keep, babies born prematurely alive where you couldn't before. And think about all the immunizations before a child's 1. It used to be a big deal, get to 1. That was a huge deal. Now we just expect kids to get to 1. And now we just expect to live past 75. And it's not always been that way. So it's become, on both ends of the scale, kind of a big problem in terms of healthcare. But really in terms of geriatrics, because it is true, it's not as pretty. We
No.
can't be cranky, just watch me. No, but it's true, it's not a pleasant, you ask 9 out of 10 nurses what they want to do. It's the babies.
Yeah.
They want to work with, pediatricians or something.
It is definitely a lot sadder, and that was one of the reasons that I didn't get to harp on as much in my topic, was that there were medical students that did not want to treat geriatrics because it was just too hard on them. And I understand that. I mean, you're taking care of someone, and that was the most compassionate one that I saw out of the reasons why people weren't choosing geriatric medicine.
I just got a comment. In your paper, you said that geriatrics is just as important as the other types of nursing, and that kind of made me think of in my paper how I talked about like stem cells and how they're from aborted fetuses, and I talked about how children inside the womb are just as important as once they're born, and it kind of just made me think that this is the kind of the other end of that spectrum.
Yeah, it's complete opposite.
Yeah.
I thought it was just like a really interesting loop that we got ourselves stuck into because we want to treat the young people so that they live longer, but then they live longer and they're older and now we don't want to care for them. But now we have so many older people that now we don't want to care for, but we cared about them when they were younger. And like Noah was saying, I was thinking the same thing, like what makes a person that's like worthy of care? Like what makes, just because they're older, why do they not deserve care? Like it was a really interesting little loop that I feel like we're stuck in now. So.
I was just hoping you could elaborate more on the geriatric M's.
Sorry, let me find it. Okay, so the geriatric M's, again, were mind, which I believe I saw a statistic that dementia, Alzheimer's, and depression and things that pertain to mental illness it's over 50% of the later geriatric population. So that's one thing that geriatric physicians must consider. And actually, that's going to be my next topic in the spring, hopefully. Mobility is that the balance as you get older, it goes a little off. And also you have patients that have osteoporosis, so their bones are weaker, and that contributes to more broken bones and things like that. And then you also have muscle mass deterioration, the buildup of fat that causes mobility to be a little off. Medication, that's actually referring to polypharmacy, which we didn't actually get to talk. You talked about that a little bit, and I think it was Emily that brought that up. But polypharmacy is when you have a lot of different prescriptions prescribed for one person, and you have to find ways of making sure they don't cross, which would happen with your patient in your paper that was given the wrong prescription. And so polypharmacy is seen as something that's very difficult to do because you're trying to find loopholes and places where you can prescribe something for someone, but make sure it doesn't cross. Because there are a lot of really horrible side effects that can happen if you're prescribed the wrong thing, which is what happened with your patient as well in your talk. Multi-complexity, that refers to the idea that there are patients that have symptoms from, I believe I mentioned it. There are patients that can have arthritis, diabetes, and pulmonary disease. So you're treating 3 different things in one patient, which also contributes to polypharmacy as well as finding the loopholes and finding ways to alleviate pain and things like that. And let's see, the last one is matters most. That one, I liked that one because that was a bit compassionate. And in that article, the looming geriatrician shortage, they talked about how there were doctors in America that were prescribing things to patients not because they cared about them having alleviating symptoms, but them to keep coming back so they get paid more. And matters most, I think, refers to that, but it also refers to the body is deteriorating. And these patients it is their last years, it is end-of-life care. And I think matters most is just trying to make people's quality of life the best it can at the end of their lives.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I just find it really interesting how our Western culture has changed so much, the beliefs and traditions that existed in past centuries, especially with old age. People used to respect and really admire our elders, and now it's completely flipped and they're looked down upon. And I just think it's crazy how youth is held to such a pedestal, but what happens after that fleeting youth is gone?
Yeah, it was really sad to read that one article by Nancy Osgood, because I cried. I'm going to be honest. It was a moment, and it was interesting because in the other article by Jared Daniel, he was talking about how children are indoctrinated with these ideas when they're young, and I always think that's interesting when people use that term indoctrinated because they say it about Christianity as well, but they're saying that they're indoctrinated to understanding that old people are evil, and he based his research on fairy tales and how the bad person is always an evil witch in the forest that's going to eat you, or an old woman who lives in a shoe that doesn't really know what she's doing, or an older man who's an evil warlock, and he's he wants money and power, and I just thought that was interesting as well.
There you go, pulling your English background.
Yes.
And we can't forget the economic aspect, and you touched on it. Eventually, there's resources that have to be allocated, and the more the insurance companies say what can and cannot be allocated, you find that with the number of days that a woman after giving birth is told she needs to leave the hospital, someone just having knee surgery, get on your feet and let's get going. There's some reason for that, I know, with knee surgeries, but there is more and more the inclination to save the money. Mm-hmm. At what point do you save the money and not treat a geriatric patient so that you can allocate the resources somewhere else? That will become the next question.
Yeah.
And so, at any rate, we're counting on y'all to hold up the right side of things. In all seriousness, it does show how we're counterculture yet again. because you do respect those that are older. And the Bible does have principles that state those very things. So, again, we're kind of
qualify to be a geriatric patient, but it's also the age of retirement. And so you also just don't have a lot of older people in the workforce, but at the same time, there are people with experience that can help you. No?
Anything else? Ms. Trigg?
Just a comment, there's a couple other countries who are doing some interesting thing with the elderly. I know we had a student on the oratory meeting who was talking about, and I'm pretty sure it was Sweden, but it's been like 5 years ago, so don't quote me. But they would set up villages, and instead of it being like a nursing home, they set up villages where everybody had their little house, and then the person who ran the post office was a medical professional, and the person who were, the people who were servers in the restaurant were medical professionals. And everyone who ran the little town, it was actually a community of elderly, so they were up and about and moving around and going and doing their things, and they were, you know, kept in so that they couldn't wander off, but they were living longer and having a better quality of life, and they were surrounded by medical professionals who these people didn't necessarily know were medical professionals, but were keeping an eye on them. And that whole mindset thing that you were talking about, thinking that you're still on your own and you're independent, I think those kind of creative things, like we have to start thinking outside the box for how we're gonna deal with these things, because if people are gonna get involved, it's gonna be something fun and exciting and unique and new, as opposed to, okay, I'm gonna see my 7th patient today who has 12 different things wrong with them, and I'm not gonna get paid anything for it. They're on Medicare.
I think honestly the mindset inside nursing homes is kind of sad too, because I've been to maybe 3 before, and every time I go I'm just disappointed with how the patients are being treated, and even just how rude the medical professionals there are. And that kind of goes into what Itza was saying about the hierarchy, but just developing like personable habits when you're talking to someone about their family member is very important, especially if you're going to be treating them as well.
Well, thank you very much, Jesse. Well, set up for you. We finish our triad of healthcare things tonight with a look at childhood healthcare and the matter of resiliency. And I think about resiliency when I try to pull up a PowerPoint presentation in front of, oh, there it is. Look at that. It worked. I'm resilient. So Emily Cook will bring us that presentation tonight. Appreciate Emily doing that and guiding us through it. So Emily.
Thank you all for coming and for staying. I know it's been a long night, but if you guys have to get up and use a restroom or whatnot, I do not care as long as you come back. So today I'm going to be talking about the role of relationships in childhood resiliency. And throughout childhood, one of the unexpected constants is change. Resiliency is the ability to adapt to and learn to thrive despite hard circumstances. There is a ton of research on resiliency in adulthood, but until recently, no one seemed to ask the question, does resiliency in childhood look different than resiliency in adulthood? And since the research on this question has started, we have found out that there is one major difference. In adulthood, the common identifying traits of resilience is rugged self-reliance, inner strength or determination, things like that. While in childhood, the main identifying factor is purely relational. It is about having solid relationships, or at least one good supportive relationship with an adult, and not as much to do with the personal traits and habits of the specific child. So an English study conducted in the early 2000s of 165 severely deprived Romanian children, research reveals that children are able to bounce back from those challenges experienced before the age of 3, so super young. The severe institutional deprivation inflicted on the Romanian orphans of the Ceausescu regime up until early 1989 may be the most extreme large-scale scene of early childhood maltreatment in recent history. Over 100,000 children were raised in institutional care in Romania alone. They were deprived of sufficient nutrition with minimal human contact and cognitive stimulation in their early years. Following adoption by stable families in England, these children played a rapid game of catch-up. So most of them showed no remaining signs of early childhood deprivation at a 4-year follow-up. These children were described as resilient, and researchers have been trying to find out what it is that determines this kind of resiliency in childhood. Obviously, it's not alone time or self-reflection or self-regulation like it is in adulthood. In fact, that's often what causes vulnerability and the main risk factor. So obviously that's not what it is. So what is it that makes some children more resilient to difficulties in cases that warrant increased vulnerability and developmental lags? Childhood is known as the formative years, right? Challenges in childhood ranging from abuse and neglect to poverty, natural disasters, parental mental illnesses, including postpartum depression or bipolar disorder, can both hinder the cognitive and physical development of a child, leading to developmental delays and behavioral, mental, and physical problems in later life. So it can affect every area of their life. And there's not just one specific cause of vulnerable children and of developmental lags. It can be a plethora of things, so many things. But it can cause problems like ADHD, quasi-autism, disinhibited social engagement, so like kids who can't seem to connect to people or seem like they're autistic even though they're really not, cognitive impairment, and malnutrition. So that's the physical side, like kids may be eating enough food, but because they're not getting all these cognitive stimulations, they appear malnourished, crazy things like that. So some people, like the Romanian orphans in our study, survive this stuff and they find ways to flourish despite the odds. So early researchers started to explore this topic, and they expected to find that there were like certain innate traits in certain children that just genetically made them more resilient. Some people were born with it, some people weren't. And that's kind of what I thought this study would go to, but that's not what they found. They found that every trait in resilient children can be learned over time through development and growth. So if these traits can be learned over time, are there ways to foster it in children as they grow? From a clinical and an economic perspective, investment in evidence-based interventions in childhood can have a significantly greater and longer-lasting impact per dollar spent compared to intervening later in life while they're adults. So, in addition, early intervention can potentially prevent the intergenerational trauma and disadvantage. So while there's a huge variation in the types of challenges that children may experience, resilience is a solution that covers all of them. Research on what factors promote resiliency in childhood is vast, and there are many different studies that identify the different factors. Like all the different studies say that one of them is more important than the others. But the one factor that's identified most often and in every single study that I looked at is relationships. So in a 2017 article published by the American Psychological Association, Dr. Philip Fisher, who is a psych professor at the University of Oregon, notes that the one thing that makes the biggest difference, even more than one's genetic blueprint, is the relationship a child has with their primary caregiver. Dr. Fisher studies early childhood interventions to improve the functioning of children from disadvantaged backgrounds, and he has found that many of the problems stemming from childhood trauma involve poor self-regulation, which is linked to parents' behavior in their home environment. Poor self-regulation in mental, emotional, and behavioral domains can be combated with parental warmth, sensitivity, and care in order to build up a child's self-regulation. Resilience rests fundamentally on relationships, says Sonia Luther, who's a doctor of psychology at Arizona State University and who has studied vulnerability and resilience for 3 decades. There are many programs that are already underway which have shown successful results to kind of combat this issue. Some of these programs focused on the child themselves, and some of them focus on the person caring for the child. So children raised with adversity or trauma typically go to school with fewer social and emotional skills compared to those who are raised in a stable home, which makes sense to us. So these skills are vital to a child's learning. So there's a collaborative for academic, social, and emotional learning, which has been started in a lot of American schools. And it incorporates evidence-based social and emotional learning into education. So basically, it takes the education that's already in place and it adds in little activities for them to kind of connect with their peers and to connect with their teacher, to learn how to deal with their emotions and things like that. So these programs build their social, emotional, and academic abilities. Support for these school programs is quickly taking root as administration realizes that these programs benefit all children, whether they're at risk or not. These programs aim to build resiliency skills, self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship skills. Another way to help children is to care for the adults who are caring for the children. Things like maternal depression or postpartum depression can leave mothers disengaged and harsh and critical with their kids. Treating maternal depression can trickle down and improve the mental health of the kids. Some programs that have been particularly successful combine therapy approaches with peer support from others, so like group therapy and getting to know other people who are in the same boat as you. These group-based interventions are both cost-effective and they encourage participants to form connections with each other, which strengthens their social networks. Things like social support, asking for help, and modeling healthy behaviors and attitudes of an adult or parent are things that are linked to positive emotions and a greater sense of self-esteem, optimism, and resilience in children. Reminding children of the people who love them, so like simply telling a child like, hey, like your grandma was talking to me today and she said like she really misses you, things like that, just little reminders are things that they can look up to, are ways to help them see those connections that they do have. Relationships that foster resiliency in childhood are not limited to the relationship the child has with their parent or their primary caregiver, as like that might be the one that's problematic. In such cases, relationships between siblings, there was one study on just the relationships with siblings, which was super interesting. Their friends, their mentors, their teachers, their coaches, and grandparents, things like those are especially important. So relationships are key to childhood resiliency because of modeling, or learning through observation and imitation is how children grow. When a child sees a parent or another person they look up to, they react to them by imitating the behaviors that a person does. And we see this all the time in kids, whether or not the behavior is good or desirable. Kids want to be like the people around them and the people they love. Children who want to grow up and be just like their parents or some character from their favorite cartoon will start adopting those mannerisms and behaviors from said person. These modeling behaviors occur all throughout childhood, and they determine who the child will be more than nearly anything else. And it starts early. It starts as early as the age of 6 months to 2 years. It has been said that you are who you surround yourself with, and things like bad company corrupts good morals. And in a book called From the Pen of Paul, which I'm sure some of you have read or were supposed to read, David McClister notes that one's own spirit is the product of all that he or she has put into themselves. And I think these points are all intrinsically connected. It makes sense to think of it this way. Who you surround yourself with is ultimately who you will become. As a child, we see our dad as he puts on his shoes and he mows the yard. We see our mother as she carefully rolls out cinnamon rolls or makes the bed every morning if she does that. We see our sister catching a frog, so we go and catch a frog just like her. We see our neighbor teach their dog tricks, so we go home and we try to teach our dog tricks. We go to church, we see our dad lead songs and our preacher give a lesson, so we go home and we play church with our siblings. We see our grandma tend to her garden and play piano, so we go plant seeds in her garden and we ask her to teach us piano. All these things and many more is how the relationships we have determine who we act like and who we become. So not only are relationships helpful in building resiliency behaviors in childhood, but relationships are arguably the only way for children to build these characteristics, because children learn things through modeling. Perhaps this is what Jesus was getting at when he brought a child to himself and told his disciples to become like little children. Perhaps this is why God gave us his Spirit to be with us and to live in us, so that since we are surrounded continually by the Spirit of God and by his family, we can become like him through the same processes that children become like their parents. So resiliency is the ability to adapt to and to learn, to grow, despite hard things. Rugged self-reliance and inner strength in childhood will not work, because that's the solution for adulthood. But it is in giving the children relationships to care for them that are healthy for them to model behaviors from. Even with change and uncertainty being constant in a child's life, resiliency provides children the ability to grow from hard things. So. Do you have any questions?
Okay, so as I was reading through this, I was thinking about like a really big problem in our country, which is the foster care system.
Mm-hmm.
The children in the foster system go through great trauma,
Yes.
and they move from home to home and school to school. What can be done to help these children with their resiliency and keep them from slipping through the cracks even further?
Yeah, that's why I started looking into this, was because I was thinking specifically of foster kids. And that's something that's growing. More and more children are being placed in this system, and you can't put all of them in good homes. Like, you just can't. Even with the homes that are already there, like, a lot of them are group homes, and a lot of them are places like you don't want your children growing up there. But just finding little ways for these children to get role models and to get those relationships one-on-one with an adult or with someone who can support them are important. So like making sure they're still connected to their grandparents, if they have good grandparents, is something that like caseworkers can work on for sure. And then also teachers, like I know we have some ed majors in here, like teachers who see that. My mom's a teacher too, and she was telling me about this, but you can identify those kids pretty easily, the ones who don't have good role models at home. And so being there for them, maybe checking up on them a little extra, just little things that all build up is kind of the only way that I found that we can work on this right now. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
You brought up the programs that are aimed to build the resiliency skills, and you talked a lot about relationship skills and how important that is, but I was just wondering if you knew any of the activities they do for self-management in these programs, or social awareness or self-awareness, if you knew specifically.
Yeah, there's some like group sessions that I was kind of like looking into because I thought it was interesting, and they'll just kind of like send kids out to play, and they'll notice like the ones who kind of go off on their own and don't play with other kids, or they'll notice the kids on the other side who just hog all the toys and don't play with anybody else. But it's kind of like you notice things like that and you see those, and then you go and you intervene, and you just say like, hey, like let's include so-and-so, or like let's play a game where we can share. And it's just a lot of those, like, kids love games and kids love playing with people, and so just little interactive things like that are the ways to get them started on things like that, like sharing and emotion regulation, like not throwing a fit after you lose a game. That's another one. But yeah, that's all I
Thank
can
you.
think of right now.
So you mentioned things that can help the parents or caregivers.
Yeah.
So like support groups for moms who have like postpartum depression and that kind of thing. How widespread are those, and how can we like raise awareness for those? Is that just like they find out through doctors, or how does that work?
Yeah, there's a lot of this is involved in community health. So any doctor's office you go to, a lot of times, like for maternal or for postpartum depression specifically, you go to like your monthly follow-up or to like a pediatric office, and all those offices have information on like local groups in the area that meet and that get together. And it might just be like 5 moms, not a lot, but they're all there for the same thing. Which you'd be surprised like how many groups there are like that, even in rural areas or places outside of big cities too. It's just really up to the provider to kind of push those and get those going. But yeah, things like that.
At the beginning of your paper, you said that it's the key to childhood resiliency is not the alone time and self-regulation. That is the key feature of resiliency in adulthood, and it's that the relationships. What did you see anything that talked about when or why the key features of the resiliency in childhood versus adulthood changes? Because that seems like a pretty drastic difference.
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up because I didn't say anything about it. Adolescency is weird and it's confusing for the adolescent, yes, but also for the people trying to figure out how to care for them. Because, it could be when a child is 12 that they kind of make that switch to where they need more of the time to like self-meditate and stuff like that, as opposed to like, I don't know, it could be when they're 18. You really don't know, like there's no set time. And there still is, like in adulthood, resiliency is about making good, meaningful relationships, but adults aren't really able to do that unless they have that time to like think through things, be able to process their thoughts and their emotions on their own. And kids, they just model the behavior, and so that's really all they need. But yeah, it's sometime in an adolescency, and that's the hard part, is that switch there. But yeah.
I found this really interesting, and viewing it from like the educational perspective,
Right.
like building resiliency and like social emotional skills in kids. I had heard like, oh, it's good in schools to teach these explicitly to kids, and I was honestly a little bit skeptical of that. But this year in my internship in 2nd grade, we've been doing that, and honestly, I think it's amazing. Like, we do lessons on like, we did one, the power of yet. So it's not like, I can't do this, it's I can't do this yet. So like shifting our mindset, more of like a growth mindset. And we also do ones on like celebrating our differences and acknowledging the strengths of ourselves, the strengths of other people. And it might sound kind of like cheesy, but the kids get so involved in these lessons. Like kids who won't ever raise their hand to answer like a math question or a reading question, they're so excited to like share their thoughts on these things and to get involved and like talk with the other students. And I feel like they really take a lot away from these lessons. So seeing that this year definitely kind of shifted my perspective. Like the relationships and the role models, they're so important. But especially for those kids like lacking that in their home life and stuff, these like incorporating those types of lessons, even if it's like 15 minutes once a week, like it can be really beneficial for kids.
Yeah. I'm so glad that you saw that in the school system already, because just reading about it on paper versus hearing that it's actually happening is really cool. So nice, cool.
You mentioned that rugged self-reliance and inner strength in adulthood is not the solution to building resiliency in children, but also if they see that in their caregiver or an adult, they can begin to model that and build that for themselves. And especially, like, I feel like that would play into adolescence. As they're transitioning into their own person, they can use what they've seen from their role models and use it for themselves, which is cool how it goes back to it's important to care for the caregivers so that they can be that for them.
Yeah. Yeah, and it is good that, I didn't clarify this before, but it is good for those kids to see their parents being like able to regulate their emotions, being self-reliant, all that independent, everything, because that's how they're able to model it. So like, not that children don't need independence or don't need to learn those traits, but that the only way they can learn them is through modeling what they see in a parent or something. So yeah, thank you.
And then also, you mentioned like this whole thing is about modeling as children, but I think it plays into like even as adults. You mentioned who we surround ourselves with really affects who we are, and I think we can apply that spiritually. It's, you know, we're always told to surround ourselves with Christ-like people, but it goes two ways, and we have to be that for someone else.
Yeah.
I like that point.
Thank you.
So with your focus in nursing, how did your research, how does this topic like connect to anything you might have been doing in your classes this year?
We're taking a population community health class, which is supposed to be one of the most boring classes, but I think it's interesting because of this. There's like all these screening tools. Like you go to the doctor and you get asked like, do you have a support system at home? And you're always like, oh, whatever. Like, yes, I just want to tell you about my problem. But there's like all these little screening tools that you can use. And in children and pediatrics, it's even more interesting because it's noticing like, you know, facial cues and like little things that how they react to what their parents say or how they react to their parents that you have to like pick up on if they're whatever, not being taken care of the right way. And with that, you're able to just, I mean, really all you can do is just suggest like programs for them or encourage them to be involved in school systems or whatever. Or if it's really bad, you can refer them to, you know, kind of flag it so that people are aware of the problem. But yeah, our population community health class is all about like educating the community and trying to like make the whole system better instead of just like an individual. So that's kind of been interesting with this. But, yeah.
You know, kids are a lot smarter than what we give them credit for being 6 months to 2 years. If God blesses you with kids, you'll see that. And it's scary because they will say things like you say them as your parents, and they'll walk like you walk. And you think, they walk terribly and they speak terribly. Where'd they learn this from? And it's from you. But it's true. I mean, they're little sponges. People talk like that. But this is also why people distrust schools sometimes, where they teach them in school. They mold them early, then this forms behaviors and habits that follow them on into later life. So it is interesting. So it's not nature as much as it's nurture, to use the old terms.
Yeah.
No?
I don't really have anything else.
Cool.
I just had a comment about like all three of y'all's talks. I think it's so interesting to see these very real and very prevalent issues, especially like specifically, I guess, in the healthcare world, and how, like through the eyes of a Christian, I feel like the solutions are so obvious, and it's like just being a good person. And it is so weird to me that like these issues are such a big deal because people don't treat others how God tells us to. And like if we would just go back to what he commands, it is all like for our good. And so like, I don't know, I just think it's interesting, and I think all three of y'all's talks really like pointed those out to me.
Yeah, they're all connected for sure.
So just to clarify, you're saying that the challenges were experienced before the age of 3, and 3 is the cutoff when you start developing more issues?
Kind of. Well, that was specifically with the Romanian orphans. They were, the ones that they studied, there were 165 orphans from these Romanian orphanages. And all of them were taken out before the age of 3. So they were all just like super little still. And they just chose them because that was like an easy group, 0 to 3 for them to study. But resiliency is like something that can be learned and like developed over time. Dr. Stafford asked, he was like, what's the point of no return? Like, when is it too late for kids to develop resilient traits? And honestly, like, there's none. There is no point of no return, which I think is really like such a blessing too, especially if you think of like, maybe that's the way God designed it, was for us to grow from hard things and to be resilient. But it is like, of course, the earlier you start, the easier it is. But yeah, the only thing I found was like before adolescence, that's when it gets really hard, because there's a lot of physical and like mental things that are also like physically something wrong with your brain that can happen. But yeah, there's no point in no return, which is cool.
Thank you.
Yeah.
As Christians, what can we do to help these children who don't have like a loving relationship with anybody that's around them? Like, how can we step in and help them build this resiliency?
That's a good question. And I think that I definitely don't have all the answers to this. And I think that's a good thing because there are so many answers out there. But obviously, like, we all interact with kids who are, like, in the church and also not in the church all the time. Like, of course, Macy Education, she goes into the classroom twice a week, teaches them. I see kids at health screenings at schools and pediatric offices. We all see kids like walking down the road. We see kids a lot, some of us more than others, but just being there for them, asking them questions, seeing them, letting them know that they're seen, those are big things. And then like, I think too, like having a community where they like have good relationships like church is really good. Things like inviting them to Bible class or inviting them to just come hang out at your house if that's okay with their parents or whatever. Just little things, building relationships with them. They all build up over time. Yeah.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience? Yes, ma'am.
I think it's interesting that what we're hearing is that the most important thing for childhood resiliency is relationships. And who are the people, but the older people that
Yes, I know.
have to, have relationships with.
Mhm.
And maybe that's not an answer to take these older people and not throw them away. Like,
Right?
maybe kind of like what God planned and when he said,
Uh,
for the older women to teach the younger women and the older men to teach the younger.
It's almost like this is all biblical. Yeah. I know. I wasn't expecting that either. But it is interesting. A lot of, the old American culture was like this. And right now, the Hispanic culture is like this, where more so than America, of course, where like the adults or the grandparents will come and live with the other family, their immediate family, their kids and grandkids. And yeah. Yeah.
I find it really exciting and refreshing
Yes.
to hear younger people seeing that,
Oh, yeah.
realizing that maybe we should get back to that.
Yep.
There's merit to that.
Yep. And research proves it too. Like we needed it, but it's true.
I was going to say that if there aren't enough for you in the churches where you are, the Big Brothers Big Sisters program is always looking for young
Yes.
people who are willing to be matched up with children whose families bring them to that organization so they can
Okay.
spend one-on-one time. I mean, there's background checks and everything else to make sure, but I would think that young Christians, I think you make a commitment to see them once a week.
What's it called? What is it called?
The Big Brothers Big Sisters program.
Big Brothers Big Sisters
I
program.
don't know if there's one, I'm sure there must be one in Tampa.
Probably. Yeah.
But it's an excellent organization, that's a national organization, so wherever you go, you can have a little brother or a little sister
Mhm.
that you nurture.
Oh, thank you. I'll have to write that down. That's perfect.
Anyone else? Thank you very much.
Thank
Did a
you.
Great job. Well, it was interesting how our three talks kind of fit together tonight. The only thing I'm worried about right now is which one of my three children will win the bidding to take care of me and my wife as we become geriatric patients. And now I know at least 7 people that are going to worry about us, right? Now, we appreciate you all being here tonight. Could have been in many places, and it's a busy week for many people, but you chose to be here, and we appreciate that very much. Appreciate, again, Yuritz's work, especially at the end of a long soccer trip. Did a great job, and Jessie with her work on geriatrics, and of course, Emily. Appreciate her work very much on the matter of resiliency and how we can help people. And it's interesting, too, and fitting that it's all about taking care of each other. So we'll try to keep that in mind as we work through the rest of the semester. Again, our last 2 meetings this semester, which will have some publicity to them, is the 15th of November, and then our last meeting will be the 6th of December. So if you can join us during those dates, please watch for the publicity on that. Thanks again for being here tonight.